welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. This is Jessica. I am here with author Jenny Herrera. Do you prefer Jenny or Jennifer?
Jennifer is fine. Jenny is great too. It usually
Excellent.
is an indication of how long somebody's known me.
So I'm assuming right now we're Jennifer because we just met like 30 seconds ago.
We can be Jenny if you want to go there. I'm totally fine with it.
Totally fine. You can call me Jess then.
I love that we've passed the social niceties and have just moved on to the real stuff.
It hasn't even been a minute either.
Hasn't even been a minute.
All right. So your book, The Hunter, is your debut novel. It is really interesting. It has a lot in it. It's a little suspense, a little bit of police procedural, family stuff. It's just chock full of everything. And I know that you'd also talked very recently about why there are so many books about women who are victim in crime and men are usually the ones who are the victims in the news. So would you just talk a little bit at first about what this book is about and just sort of how all the pieces came together?
Yes, absolutely. So the book follows an NYPD detective who has made just a really big mistake. So she pointed her sidearm at her partner and she let a suspect get away. Now, when she did this, it destroyed her whole life. Her husband left her. She lost her job with the NYPD and she feels like she's completely adrift. And then she gets this call from her brother, who is a police officer in her hometown. And he says, there are these 3 suspicious deaths. Can she come and investigate? Now, she gets in her head that if she solves this big case, her husband will welcome her back. Her job will welcome her back. And her crumbling life will just suddenly reconstitute itself. But of course, it's not that easy. When she goes back home, she has to deal with all of this emotional baggage that she's been, avoiding for years and years and years. But as it turns out, dealing with all that emotional baggage is going to be key to figuring out, who done it in this case. And also it's going to be key to figuring out why she made that really big mistake. So what I like about this book is that you have an unreliable narrator, but she's not unreliable in the traditional ways. She doesn't have a mental condition where her experiences aren't to be trusted. She doesn't have an addiction to alcohol or an addiction to drugs. She's just profoundly human. And like every single human on this planet, she's told herself a story about her own life. And it turns out, in many ways, that story is not really accurate. So one of the things that I was really interested in doing in this case was to have something where you felt like, again, the narrator wasn't necessarily reliable, creating that tension, but in a way that didn't feel gimmicky. Like I felt like, as somebody who doesn't have any active addictions, they don't have a mental condition or a medical condition, I felt like I couldn't relate to a lot of these protagonists, right? Like girl on the train, etc. And so I wanted to create a protagonist who I did relate to. And I think that, as like every human, we all do things and we don't necessarily understand why we did them. So I wanted to infuse that into the story. And the other main element that I wanted to create was just this sense of, a woman being the one with power and the men being the victims. We'd sort of touched upon this a little bit earlier. You did with your initial question. This idea that in most crime fiction, women tend to be the victims. My own informal study of this shows that, women are the victims in crime fiction about 3 times the rate of men. So a lot, like it's not just like twice as much, it's like 3 times as much. And that doesn't match the reality of the world. So if, you look at statistics of actual homicides, men are the victims 80% of the time. So to me, that created an opportunity to really create a different kind of crime fiction Right, where the woman is the detective, the one with the power, the one with the insight, the men are the victims. While at the same time getting to explore this question of why do we read so many books about dead women?
Yeah, why indeed? And yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm not innocent. I
None
consume
of us is.
no, and I consume a lot of true crime. And
Uh-huh.
when I was younger, I always say like I talk about how like so y- I am guilty. I used to watch Lifetime movies as background
Mhm.
noise for
Oh
my,
yeah.
yeah, for like when I would write papers. And part of it was because like it would kind of motivate me not to watch television because it was always so ridiculous. But there was always something about them that just kind of like got me. I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
this is messed up. But like it's always, I thought it was crazy. I'm like, Lifetime television for women, or at least that's, what it was called when I was growing up. I don't know if it's
Yeah.
the same. But it was
Yeah.
like, I used to be like, are women supposed to be masochists? Because every
Yeah.
single movie in
Uh-huh.
Lifetime is like abuse. And,
Uh-huh.
you know, babies being stolen and
Uh-huh. All of
con
like women's
artists.
worst, like
Yeah,
worst fears.
100%. But I mean, this is a big industry, and women are sort of, writing true crime. They're
Mhm.
doing true crime podcasts, and a lot of stories centering around disappeared and dead women are what seem to get the most traction. This is a
And why do
real,
you think that is? I'm
oh
so
man,
curious. Tell me. I want to hear your
you
theories.
want to hear my feelings?
I
My
do want to hear.
feelings are because, and I've said this a few times, because I think that it offers a sense of control.
Mm,
And when you are a woman and you are raised to basically be told that the world is going to see you a certain way,
mhm.
that there is always a predator lurking, don't talk to men, don't do this, don't do
Right.
that. And then you see the worst happening. It's almost like you're watching it from a bird's eye view and being like, okay, maybe I can help figure out why this happened, and
Mhm.
also maybe I can avoid this situation. It's
Mhm.
very, very strange, though. That's just my take on it.
Yeah, well, I'm curious, like whether you think though, because I mean, I obviously get that, and I understand it too, and I think that's a lot of the reason why I'm drawn to crime fiction too. It's like this idea of like, okay, you imagine the worst scenario, and how do you get yourself out of it? Like this sense of, okay, there's always a way out. You have control. But I think the interesting thing is, it's like at least with violence against women, like a lot of this isn't just especially if we're talking about like strictly homicide, like it's not it doesn't pan out in terms of the facts. Like it skews our reality in some way to think like, something bad is always going to befall us. And so the question is like the big question for me is like, is this actually fulfilling some sort of like psychological good for us? And that's why we're doing it. Or is it, the long tail of a kind of like a social control? Like helping, quote unquote, women to control their bodies or teaching them to control their bodies, to control who they talk to control how much they drink when they're in public, to like feel as if every man they meet is a predator, because then that puts them on high alert and then they feel small and they feel helpless and they feel like they need to attach themselves to a man in order to have protection. And so that's my question.
It's a very good one, and honestly, I don't have an answer myself.
Me neither. Me neither.
But like with the book, what I thought was interesting, so Leo O'Donnell, she has a daughter, Simone, and she brings her to this town, this very weird small town where she grows up, where her brothers and her uncles are, who, by the way, are all great characters. I like, it's very insular, Copper Falls,
Yeah.
and there are these three deaths that occur mysteriously, and then there's all sorts of other stuff that's going on under the surface. There's like twin sisters, and there's prominent families and ancient shrines. and of course, like a high school friend who might have been more, but it's just like it reminded me very slightly of like a Twin Peaks type situation where
Yeah.
you come into this town and you're just like, small town, everything looks peachy on the outside, but oh, there's some weird workings going on here.
Uh-huh.
Um, what were your inspirations for the background of Copper Falls that Lee was getting into?
Yeah. So I think that there are a couple layers to answering that. One is just like the landscape of the place. So I'm from rural Ohio, but it doesn't look anything like this gorgeous Copper Falls. And I really wanted to be able to like have readers come to this book and feel like they could have an escape. Like you're so immersed in the sensory details that you can just like forget about the world for the rest of the time. And so, in the book there are all of these like gorgeous caves and these huge waterfalls, and you get this sense of this very this place that has a lot of these like lovely Victorian houses that are all beautifully restored, while also getting all of these like lush details in the environment itself. And so, to create something like that, I looked to different parts of Ohio, especially like the Hocking Hills area, which has a lot of those details. And then in terms of a lot of the other stuff, the insular nature of the community, the ways in which, everybody seems like they're related, that sort of like Twin Peaks, like, is this weird? Like, what's going on here sort of vibe. That I think really does come from the way that I grew up. So I am from rural Ohio, but not originally. My family is from Cleveland. I was raised in a trailer park until I was about 5, which was just like a very diverse place in every way, I guess, besides economically. And then we moved to this really small town, population 1,300. Everybody was related. Everybody, sort of looked alike. They all went to the same church. They all had the exact same beliefs, which were very, very different from like, the urban beliefs that, I was raised with. And so I felt like such an alien in this place. And I was like, this place is so weird and nobody is talking about it. And I knew it was weird because of where I had lived before. And so that feeling of being alien in your own, like, quote unquote home, that was very real to me. And that came out of, my experiences growing up.
And there's the lore of the story.
Mm.
And if I was to talk more about it, it would give stuff away. But I really loved it. And one thing that I really also enjoyed was you have like a Twilight Zone reference, and I am a huge Twilight Zone fan. Um,
Me
yeah,
too. Me too. I think I did that for my dad too. We used to watch the marathons every New Year's.
100%. Yeah, so did we. And I think this is like the first year that I didn't watch it as much as I have in the past.
Mhm.
Myself. But yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about the lore and also just about the Twilight Zone that you referenced?
Oh, the Twilight Zone. Nobody has asked me about that before. It makes me so happy that you're asking now. That's one of my favorite episodes, and one of the ones that's like the crispest in my mind. It's, for listeners who maybe are Twilight Zone geeks like we are. Um, is this episode where you have this starlet who used to be something, and she now she's had a hard time getting roles because she's older. She's afraid of like putting herself out there, and so she just watches movies of herself all day. And she has created this tomb for herself where she's living in this land of nostalgia, and she can't escape because her life as it is now can never compare to what it used to be. And so for me, that was a really great metaphor for change in general. And why change is so hard, because part of you is always looking toward some sort of perfect past, even if it wasn't really perfect. Like there's this image you have that you can't move on from, so that it gets you stuck in this pattern. And so the character Lee, I really wanted like show her how to get out of this stuck pattern that she's in. And so that episode was so perfect. In fact, when I had included it, this is a fun story, when I had included it in the draft and I sent it to my editor and I included some lines from it, she said that's too on the nose. That dialogue is too on the nose with the plot. And I was like, but that's word for word what happens in the episode. And she was like, oh, then I guess you could keep it. But it was one of those things that I think one of the things I love about the Twilight Zone, and I could talk about this all day, is just how it takes common human problems and it magnifies them to the point where it's like, maybe if it happened in a very subtle way, you couldn't see what the issue was. But then because they've magnified it so much, you get such a strong sense of like, oh, that's why, it's problematic to be scrolling on my phone and to be constantly looking at photos from 2 years ago, or from pre-pandemic even, and to not ever leave my house. Like, oh, that's why that's bad. And then the other part of the lore, I think, which feels very close to my heart, which is this sense of a bootstraps lore that I think at least I was raised to believe was true about the world. You could start from nothing, pull yourself up from your bootstraps, and you could go on to do whatever you wanted. And in fact, the real, what's interesting, and this didn't make it into the book, but the original idea of like bootstraps, pulling yourself up from the bootstraps, was actually meant to show how impossible it was. Like the original quote from whoever said it's so impossible to pull yourself up by your bootstraps that of course this isn't true. But somehow American capitalism, like we've translated it to, it is possible to pull yourself up from your bootstraps.
100%. And I think there's like a quote from, I think, I don't want to misquote anyone, but I feel like maybe it was Martin Luther King, just something to the effect of, that it's difficult to pull yourself up from your bootstraps if you don't have boots.
Yeah.
Which, but that's very interesting, about that quote. I actually had no idea. Yeah, for sure. There is a lot of that. And then there's other parts to the story too, which are, about the indigenous cultures that inhabit places, who were basically just like, yeah, you don't live here anymore. And all this stuff that's yours and part of your culture, it's not going to be, you have no access to it anymore. Yeah.
And I feel like that was important to represent, and that relates to this bootstraps idea, because it's like, these people, the history of this town is they've come to this land, they were pioneers, it was unoccupied, and then they were able to create vast amounts of wealth from nothing. And so it was really important to me to represent, the sovereign nations that had lived in that area before the town was founded, and to represent some of their, and in this case, invented history, because the whole thing is invented, the whole place is invented. So that you got this sense of like, no, this mythology that you've created around bootstraps is just that, it's a myth. And then the question is, like the sort of myth of us feeling like as a woman you're more vulnerable to being killed than as a man. Like the question is, what is this myth doing for this town? And how is this myth, again, like this descent into nostalgia, in the same way the main character is assaulted by this nostalgia, how is this nostalgia preventing the town from growing?
I really loved Lee's family. They were all very interesting. Do you have a favorite character?
I do love the uncles. I really do.
Yeah.
So, to put it in some context, I have many uncles. I don't know if readers also can relate to this. I have many uncles, and sort of when they all get in the same room with each other, they almost become tropes. It's like this one's the funny one, and this one's the straight-faced one, and this one's the sweet, one who's gonna stand back. So it was fun to get to represent that dynamic of like that big family with like the back and forth that happens with that, because I think that again is like, is this very loving space that Lee, having left her hometown, is not allowing herself to enter. And so one of the pivotal scenes of the book is when, she's been very off to the side with her family, hasn't really been involved with them as much. And when they all have dinner together, and it's like finally she integrates herself into that dynamic, right? Into that back and forth that happens with the uncles, so that you get this sense of like, oh, she's developed this integrated self where she's not just, the person who left, but she's an adult now who's relating to her, her family in this like really interesting, loving way. And I think for me, when I think about what I wanted the book to do, part of it was to give this sense of like that this person can heal with the help of her family.
Sure. Yeah, no, it was just so well done, and there's just so many characters in this book to enjoy. Also, just before we go, Mason, um, he was interesting.
Yeah, wasn't he?
Were you basing him on anybody?
Oh, that's such a good question. Uh, sometimes I think all of the characters are like a version of myself. So I think,
That's awesome.
Mason is somebody I know. It's really sad to be like this guy who's a little rough around the edges, and you kind of like him, but you don't like him. He's also a version of me. That's terrifying. Um, but I think, Mason is this guy who also left Copper Falls, and he's become a journalist. And part of his success has come at the exploitation of the place where he was from. So there are these historic, suspicious deaths. And he writes this big piece about them in the Rolling Stone. He gets like, famous within certain circles. And he's just like riding that high of that person. And he, in some ways, is just this guy who was very unpopular in high school, wore, I think, like a leather trench and an ankh necklace, and just like said really weird things like significant dexterity,
He
which,
was that guy.
he was that
Every
guy.
school has at least one of that guy.
Yes, yes, yes. So I guess I was never that guy. So maybe I'm being too hard on myself saying he's also a version of me. But he then has grown up, right? And he has this taste of fame, and he thinks very well of himself. And now he's got very into fitness. He's like very muscular, he's very beautiful. And I think that he's also very tempting for the main character, Lee, because she sees in him something. And I think that maybe as a reader, you think it's just about sex. But she sees something in him that is part of the reason why things with her husband are on the rocks. And once she realizes that the one thing she really loves about him is the one thing that, is something she has to deal with within her marriage, then you sort of start to realize that, oh, this isn't just about somebody like having a wandering eye. This is about somebody like trying to work through what's really going on with her relationship so that she can have a healthy marriage.
Thank you so much. This book is great.
Oh,
I'm
thank you.
really excited to recommend it to people. Are you working on another book after this?
Oh, yeah. So Lee is actually getting a second book. So there'll be more from
Hoping
her.
that it was going to be something like that because I was I was hoping that that's what you were going to say.
Oh, that's so nice to hear. Yes, me too. So luckily the publisher agreed.
Well, I'm not going to ask too much about that because I think people should await the next one. Does it have a title, or are you not allowed to say?
Oh, it has a title that I call it, but it has to go through all of these approvals. So it's not
Sure.
the real title until it gets approved by all of the people.
Fair enough. Well, thank you so much. Come back and chat
Thank
with us
you.
about Lee again if
I would
you
love to.
are interested.
I would love to.
Or Twilight Zone. I'm always up for that.
I was gonna say, yeah, if you want to share your favorite Twilight Zone episode.
Oh man, it's definitely 22, which is the one about the dancer who she's in the hospital, I think, for exhaustion, and she
Oh,
keeps
yeah.
having a reoccurring dream that she goes down to room 22, which is the morgue, and like
Uh-huh.
the nurse keeps saying something to the effect of there's room for one more. And I'm not going to say anything else because it'll give away the ending. But
Such
man,
a
is
good
that a
choice.
super, super creepy episode. But at the same time, I have to also say that's my one of them. Another one of my all-time favorite episodes is Nick of Time with which is not the Shatner episode where he's on a plane. It's the one with the fortune teller. And I
Hmm.
think that those two episodes both play into a theme of fate, which is why
Hmm.
I like them both very much. But yeah, it would be that.
Oh, that's so fascinating. And I love that you actually knew the names of the episodes. I'm
Yeah,
terrible with
I
that.
watched a lot of Twilight Zone.
I mean, they make it so easy for you, right? Every New Year's, the marathon.
and
That's what
and
I did too with background. Like you said, background was Lifetime Channel. My background was Twilight Zone.
my background definitely became Twilight Zone, and I think like 4th of July there's a marathon too now.
Oh, is there?
I think so. Anyway,
There
so
should be.
guests who are still with us, check out The Hunter by Jennifer Herrera, and watch The Twilight Zone.
Do it at the same time,
Yeah,
actually.
seriously. And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.